part of ADHD, beyond this sort of distractibility and whatnot, is that emotional regulation piece. Folks with ADHD tend to feel their feelings a little bit more. I mean, they're the right feelings. You know, depression and anxiety distort our feelings, but folks with ADHD usually have the right feelings, so to speak, for the situation.
Hi, welcome to the ADHD Social Playbook podcast. I am your host, Caroline Maguire. Before we get into it, this is part 2 of my conversation with ADHD expert and my friend, Dr. Ari Tuckman. So if you haven't watched part 1, click on the link in the description below and go back to part 1. In part 2, we talk about the lies we tell ourselves and how to cope with anxiety and how to be uncomfortable, but also honor our needs. Let's get into it. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. For any neurodivergent people watching, I have typical friends who are on time, you know, if they want to be, right? Who bring dessert also because their lives are crazy and they have multiple kids and they're heading from soccer to this to whatever to the dinner party. And so they know they're there by dessert and they don't think anything of it. Right? And that's a big distinction. They don't sit around saying, I'm so terrible. I'm a person who can only bring dessert.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
They're like, my life is crazy and traffic is horrible. And I know that I might be late. And I think that's something that we have to have in terms of like perspective, because it's not, the problem isn't always you, right? And we tend to say, oh, the problem is me.
Well, the problem is not necessarily what happens. The problem is how you interpret what happens.
Right.
Yeah. So what's your dilemma?
Absolutely. Okay. So my dilemma is, what's the difference between the idea of this spotlight effect and social anxiety? Like, is the spotlight effect just like folded into it?
Yeah. So spotlight effect is this idea, like we all have this sort of cognitive bias that like the things that we do, like whatever we did, people really noticed it, you know, because we noticed it. So we assumed everybody else noticed it. But, you know, of course, the reality is, no offense, like none of us are actually that interesting most of the time. You know what I mean?
I think you're right.
So like there is, again, this inherent bias that all people have for the most part. But I think for those folks who overdo it, who really worry that, you know, I stumbled over one word and it's all anyone could think of when they left the meeting or whatever, I think it's a part of social anxiety, right? That it's sort of an aspect of it. But I would also say it might go the other way, that those who, for whatever reasons, are really prone to, you know, being highly attentive to what they do versus oblivious to what they do, right? Highly attentive to what they do, will assume other people are also highly attentive, which certainly sets up social anxiety, right? So if you had kind of rigid, critical, you know, people around you in your upbringing, or just people who paid a lot of attention to things, I think it makes it easier to go there, you know, like it primes you for that spotlight effect.
I think that's true. I mean, I think our parents of origin, our families, the context we grew up in, our schooling, right? You know, your parents might be great, but the school you went to, I know I really struggle with certain things because we used to have these morning meetings. And we would stand up and make announcements, and they would literally in front of everyone say, Miss Maguire, you know, you just stumbled over that, or you made a grammatical mistake. Please say that again. So I'm always self-judging the grammar, right? Because that was a thing, and they thought they were doing us all, you know, this great favor, turning us into these, you know, grammatically correct beings.
They thought it was a Toastmasters meeting or something.
And they really did.
And this is why you become a public speaker. I owe it all to them.
I will attribute it to them. I will tell you that I had friends who would literally hand me the slip of paper and say, you will make the announcement for me because I cannot face that scrutiny, you know? And so I became like deputized to take this.
But even that example, right? It's sort of, there are ways of offering the feedback that build the person up and make them excited to keep going. And there are ways of giving it that make them feel smaller and like they want to hide away, you know? Um, but it's, so some of it's on the teachers and how they set it, but it's also on the kid and how they interpret it, right? Because again, like you have history, so even if the teacher is being kind of friendly and whatever, that kid who's highly sort of anxious and self-critical might take it as the teacher hates me. It's like, no, they just said you should say the instead of the or whatever the hell, right? So, so it's like we're always running stuff through the lens that we have, which tend to have this sort of, we tend to sort of reinforce what we started with.
I think that's true. I mean, I think that's really true. And I think that there's an assumption for people who really struggle socially that like, I must have been the one who messed up. It must be me that made them leave me out of this activity. And I think we attribute that a lot to, these faux pas. Like, it has to be me because, I have this history. And it's really about that interpretation, because I think a lot of times when people tell me stories, I'm like, it really feels to me like, this isn't a great group for you, or, they just are insensitive, whatever it is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's definitely true. So, so again, like part of this sort of path to better is, some of it is finding ways to be more on top of things generally, whatever that means, right? But it's also about that, like, being easier on yourself, or at least running some experiments and finding out, as well as changing your social circles if you need to, or seeking out better social circles. And, some of it's just about kind of accepting it, of like, I'm going to feel anxious when I go to that party. And also, it's good for me to go to the party. And probably also, I'll be much more anxious in the first 5 minutes than, the fourth 5 minutes, so to speak. So I just need to go anyway, right? So this thing of like, I only do things that don't make me anxious, like you won't leave the house, and you shouldn't look at your phone either then.
Yeah, definitely don't look at your phone. I think there's also this distress tolerance that, if you read all of Barclay's stuff, it really feels like somewhere along the way, due to the emotional regulation stuff that we struggle with, that should be diagnosis criteria, but is not, we really struggle with that piece, and that there is this sort of, I have to learn to be uncomfortable or be in the emotion and then process the emotion. And I think there's also, being taught, right? Being taught the skills, but it feels like there's just so much emotional processing and modulation that doesn't always happen. And then that makes it so that people are really struggling with that piece when they feel like, oh God, I messed up.
Yeah, I mean, definitely part of ADHD, beyond this sort of distractibility and whatnot, is that emotional regulation piece that, I sort of talk that like folks with ADHD tend to feel their feelings a little bit more. I mean, they're the right feelings, like it's not like, depression and anxiety distort our feelings. But folks with ADHD usually have the right feelings, so to speak, for the situation, right? That if your flight is delayed, you should be disappointed and frustrated. If you got a bad grade on a test, you should feel bad about it. If, I don't know, you found out your friend can do a sleepover, you should be happy and run around the house, right? It is the right feelings, but it can sometimes, like, if you feel those feelings more intensely, you're more likely to express those feelings more intensely, and then you're more likely to act on those feelings. So, I sort of, again, half jokingly say, if you do something in the spur of the moment based on, whatever you're feeling, and it works out well, we say that you're being spontaneous. If it works out poorly, we say you're being impulsive, But, part of this is what makes folks with ADHD a whole lot of fun to hang out with, until you get angry and irritable and cranky, But it's also part of why the more sort of uptight neurotypical folks tend to gravitate towards folks with ADHD, right? Because they need a bit of spark in their life.
We are fun. We
Yes.
are very fun.
Yeah.
And chatty and creative and all those things and interesting. And if you ask people around here if I, am out at dinner every night during the conference or whatever, they'd be like, no way. But I love it. I'm talking to everybody because everybody's really fun.
Yeah.
There are certain people, I mean, this is what I've found also as a mother of kids who are neurodivergent. Like, there are certain people who are attracted to us or are at least supportive and wonderful. One of my friends, is a preschool teacher for kids on the spectrum, right? Like, she's totally cool with us. She brings dessert too. Like, we're all good together, right? And, I think there's certain people who are attracted to us. And I think that there's certain people who also say, hey, I'm this way. And it's nice to have a foil, and that to me is also that perspective taking and that support that I would be looking for. I mean, like, filtered toward people who say, this is really fun. And like, some people would be judgmental of your friends in the post office filling out their college applications, and other people would think it's a hysterical, funny story. And some of that is, how do you calibrate who I'm going to find as my people?
Yeah.
People think the post office story is funny because otherwise you live in a cave of judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's the thing, right? It's sort of, neither of us said anything about like finding people who tolerate your ADHD, right?
No.
Right. It's finding people who love the rest of what you bring to the party, so to speak, who can appreciate the rest of who you are and can be cool about the fact that being on time or bringing the right lid for the Tupperware or whatever the hell, like, not your strength, but like they can be cool with that.
Or maybe forgetting the Tupperware in the refrigerator and having to go home to get it.
Yeah,
anything.
exactly.
You had a presentation a long time ago that is one of my favorites, where you talked about the lies we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And just like this, you had really good humor about it. And it was all about like, we tell ourselves these sort of rationalizings. And one of the things I was thinking of today was that I do think sometimes about emotions and anxiety, we kind of lie to ourselves a little bit. And we're either like, oh, it's not so bad, right? Or we're kind of like, this is something that a lot of kids say to me. They'll be like, everyone knows I'm anxious, so they should accommodate me. And I'm like, no, life doesn't work that way, right?
There's two problems in that statement. First of all, they don't know. Second of all, no, they shouldn't.
That's what I always put out. How will they know? Like,
Right.
do they parachute inside your brain?
Wait a second. I'm thinking okay, got it. Yes.
I do think there's an element of sort of also lying to yourself about how much this affects my lens and my life. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that, but I was thinking about you and us talking, and I was like, we do lie to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we all do, first of all. This is like, people with ADHD didn't invent this, right? Like, so, this idea of like, what are your favorite lies or the lies that we tell ourselves? So, depending on who you are and what your circumstances are, some lies will become more, easy to get to than others. So for example, if you tend to drink too much, you'll tell yourself like, yeah, but I mean, everybody drinks 6 beers, like, no, only the people you hang out with drink 6 beers. And that's because people who drink 1 beer don't hang out with you. Right. Like,
Right.
But it's a convenient way of not having to address the fact that maybe you need to, cut back. If you have ADHD, the sort of an easy lie is, oh, I don't have to write that down. I'll remember it. Or this will just take a sec. I'm just going to no, nothing ever takes a sec. Or, I'm just going to look on social media and like, no, you're gone for an hour, like commit to it. So it's these little lies we tell ourselves to make the present moment easier, right? And we let ourselves off the hook. And I think anytime you use the word just, like pay very close attention to what's coming next, because probably you're trying to talk yourself into something that's not as good as you're trying to believe it is. So, but, for folks who have social anxiety, some of the lies might be things like, I don't have anything in common with the people at that barbecue, or they don't really like me anyway, or it's too far away. Why would I bother? I've got stuff to do. Or, right, it's these sort of justifications that remove the discomfort or the pressure of, I should really just go to this thing. Like I should go, but I don't want to because I feel uncomfortable about it. So, a big part of kind of cognitive behavioral therapy or talking to a good friend is kind of challenging and calling out those lies, right? Or distortions or justifications or whatever you want to call them. And that like, no, not necessarily. I know it might feel that way, but I don't know. I don't see it that same way. Or maybe we need to test it out and see what we see.
One of the things I bump up against is uncomfortable, right? And so I try to, I'm not a therapist, right? So I try to be very deferential to the fact that I am not a therapist, right? But I do say from personal experience, having been bullied, having made many of social faux pas, like I'm uncomfortable a lot of the time, right? Like most things I do, I'm pretty uncomfortable. And I have to be uncomfortable to do it, right? That's kind of where I come from lived experience, right? But I also run up against with anxious people, and I'm an anxious person too, but I run up against this I don't want to be uncomfortable underlying thing.
Sure.
And, I've been asking therapists, like, to me, if you have diagnosed social anxiety, fine, I'm going to your doctor and I'm not going to tell them to do something with that. But to me, there is a discomfort to this. We have to be uncomfortable. And I just wonder what you think, because I don't know how to do anything new without being uncomfortable.
So there's this kind of school of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or it's often abbreviated down to ACT. And this is a ridiculously oversimplification of it, but this is an idea from ACT, which is that an interesting life is opposed to a comfortable life, right? If you want to be comfortable, it'll be easy. You won't be uncomfortable, but it's not going to be interesting, right? Sitting at home doing not much, very comfortable, also pretty boring. As opposed to do more interesting things, it means sometimes you're going to be uncomfortable, right? It might be that you feel anxious, that you got to put yourself out there. It might be that you're physically uncomfortable. I think about the big ADHD conference in November that we all go to. Let's be honest, it's a pain in the ass, right? Like you got to wake up early and you got to park at the airport and you hope your stupid flight isn't delayed and and then you got to schlep, you got to figure out where the hell the cabs or the Ubers or the train or it's a pain, but it's awesome because it's like really fun and there's cool people there and it's worth doing,
Right.
By contrast, if I just sat at home for the weekend, it would be pretty comfortable, but no offense to the people I live with or the cats or anything, but it's not as fun as hanging out with all you guys for a weekend, So we accept the discomfort in pursuit of something more interesting, exciting, meaningful, something that builds to something bigger.
There is so much out there about ADHD and anxiety too, as we wrap up. And that information, I think, can be life-changing. I mean, it has been for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and absolutely, I totally agree. I mean, that's why I do all these things like this. I do a lot of free stuff like this. And it's also fun to hang out with you. I mean, that's the truth. But I'm putting a positive, I'm trying to get bonus points here. Right. Well,
in case your wife watches and she's like, what are you doing on a Friday afternoon?
No, she's not watching. She's like, whatever. But it's also all the stuff that I do for the conference and all the things that you do. And because it does make people's lives better. And I don't know, I think that there's nothing better than that, right? To feel like you're having some positive impact in the world. And, if your anxiety is holding you back from doing that, like, I think you're depriving yourself of something pretty important.
Oh, that's really well put. That will be a quote. I'll be running all this by you.